Welcome to Silent Screams, where darkness, whispers, and terror await you. Are you ready to confront your fears? Story 1: The Legend of the Mirror Man. Every city has its secrets, those whispered warnings and urban legends meant to scare, but mostly dismissed as fiction. In the heart of Clayton, a small industrial town with crumbling brick buildings and flickering streetlights, there was one legend that everyone knew: the Mirror Man. They said he appeared in mirrors at midnight if you stood alone, chanting his name. Some claimed to have seen him, a shadowy figure with hollow eyes and a face stretched into an unnatural grin. Most dismissed it as nonsense. But for Amy, the legend became an obsession. Amy was a journalist for a failing local paper, desperate for a story to revive her career. When she stumbled upon old police reports of missing persons linked to mirror-related incidents, she knew she had found her angle. Her investigation led her to abandoned houses, forgotten archives, and whispers of something darker than mere superstition. But she didn't know that some legends were never meant to be explored. Amy sat in her dimly lit apartment, surrounded by clippings and notes. Each missing person case had eerie similarities: the victim was last seen alone at night, and the police always found shattered mirrors at the scene. One witness, a retired shopkeeper, claimed he saw a dark figure pull someone into the mirror. Determined to uncover the truth, Amy visited an antique shop rumored to sell items tied to local legends. The shopkeeper, a gaunt woman with piercing eyes, handed her a small, tarnished hand mirror. "This mirror," the woman whispered, "once belonged to someone who disappeared. They say it still holds his reflection." Amy took the mirror home, her curiosity outweighing her fear. That night, she stared into the mirror, her own face barely visible against the darkened glass. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw another face behind hers, a pale, grinning face. The next day, Amy interviewed a local historian, Mr. Ellsworth, who specialized in urban legends. "The Mirror Man is no mere ghost story," Ellsworth explained. "It's a manifestation. They say he feeds on the souls of those who summon him. He doesn't just kill, he takes them into his world, a place beyond reflection." Ellsworth warned Amy not to investigate further, but she was undeterred. That night, armed with her recorder and the antique mirror, she decided to test the legend. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror at midnight and began the chant. "Mirror Man, show yourself. Mirror Man, take my hand." The room grew unnaturally cold. The lights flickered. Amy's reflection began to distort, her face elongating unnaturally. Behind her, a shadowy figure emerged, grinning with impossibly sharp teeth. She screamed and turned, but there was no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, her reflection was gone. Amy began experiencing strange phenomena. Mirrors around her cracked without cause. She saw glimpses of her own reflection moving independently, grinning when she wasn't. Worst of all, she started hearing whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that grew louder at night. Desperate for answers, Amy returned to Ellsworth, who revealed an ancient text describing mirror entities. These beings could trap their victims in their own dimension, leaving behind only a distorted reflection to lure others. Amy realized she was marked. The Mirror Man wasn't just haunting her, he was trying to pull her into his world. As Amy's mental state deteriorated, she decided to confront the Mirror Man once and for all. Armed with the antique mirror, she returned to the abandoned house where the legend was said to have originated. Inside, the walls were lined with shattered mirrors, each reflecting a distorted version of her. She stood before the largest intact mirror and repeated the chant. This time, the mirror man didn't wait. He emerged fully. A grotesque figure with elongated limbs and a face that seemed to shift and twist. Amy felt herself being pulled into the mirror, her surroundings warping and fading into darkness. In a final act of defiance, she smashed the antique mirror, hoping to break his hold. The shards scattered, and the mirror man let out a piercing scream before vanishing. Weeks later, Amy's disappearance became just another mystery in the town's archives. Her apartment was left untouched, except for the cracked mirrors and her notes. But locals began to notice something strange. In mirrors around town, people claimed to see Amy's reflection. Her face twisted into the same unnatural grin as the mirror man. Some say she succeeded in breaking his hold, but at a terrible cost. Others believe she became part of the legend, a warning for anyone foolish enough to summon him. And late at night, when the town grows silent, you can still hear her whispers. Mirror man, show yourself. Story 2, The Vanishing of Hollow Brook. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the town of Hollow Brook had always been shrouded in mystery. Outsiders rarely visited, and those who did often described a suffocating silence that seemed to hang over the place. Locals whispered about an urban legend known as the Vanishing, a phenomenon where people simply disappeared without a trace after venturing into the woods that surrounded the town. According to the stories, the forest wasn't just a place, it was alive, with eyes that watched and shadows that whispered. One particular detail made the legend all the more chilling: the missing often reappeared briefly in photographs, standing in the background with vacant stares, as though they were trying to warn the living. Jessica Lane, a young journalist with a passion for unraveling urban myths, arrived in Hollow Brook one crisp autumn evening. She had spent weeks researching the town, poring over every scrap of information she could find about the Vanishing. Hollow Brook's residents were notoriously tight-lipped, but Jessica was determined to crack the mystery. Her opportunity came in the form of an old journal she had purchased at a flea market in a nearby town. The journal belonged to a woman named Clara Hayes, who had vanished in Hollow Brook 10 years earlier. Its pages contained cryptic entries about the forest and a recurring phrase, "The trees know." Jessica decided to stay at the local inn, run by an elderly woman named Mrs. Carter. The innkeeper seemed uneasy when Jessica mentioned her plans to explore the woods. "You'd best leave those trees alone," Mrs. Carter warned, her voice trembling. "People don't come back from there, miss." But Jessica brushed off the warning. She had heard similar tales before, and they always turned out to be more fiction than fact. Still, as she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, armed with her camera and Clara's journal, Jessica ventured into the forest. The air was heavy, and the light barely penetrated the canopy of twisted branches overhead. As she followed a faint trail marked in the journal, she noticed strange symbols carved into the trees: spirals, eyes, and cryptic runes. A few hours in, Jessica began hearing whispers. At first, she dismissed them as the wind, but the voices grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to close in around her. The air grew colder, and her breath came out in visible puffs. Suddenly, Jessica's camera beeped. She looked down to see a new photo had been taken, even though she hadn't pressed the shutter. The image sent a chill down her spine. It showed her standing on the trail, but in the background was a figure. It was blurry, but unmistakably human. The face was pale. And the eyes, hollow. Panicking, Jessica tried to retrace her steps. But the trail had vanished. Every tree looked the same. And the whispers were now a cacophony, surrounding her. She remembered Clara's journal and flipped through it, searching for answers. One page caught her eye: the way out is through them. Don't let them touch you. The words made no sense. But Jessica had no other choice but to move forward. She pressed deeper into the forest. And that's when she saw them, the Watchers. They stood among the trees, barely distinguishable from the shadows. Their bodies were emaciated, their faces void of features except for deep, sunken eyes that oozed darkness. They didn't move, but their presence was suffocating. Jessica's heart pounded as she tried to avoid their gaze. She remembered the journal's warning and kept her distance. The further she walked, the more Watchers appeared, until they lined the trail on either side, motionless yet undeniably alive. After what felt like hours, Jessica stumbled upon a clearing. At its center stood a decrepit cabin, its windows shattered and door ajar. The symbols from the trees were scrawled all over its exterior, summoning her courage. Jessica entered. Inside, the cabin was eerily empty except for a single item, a mirror mounted on the far wall. As Jessica approached, she noticed her reflection wasn't quite right. Her face looked pale, her eyes hollow. Behind her, the Watchers stood, filling the room. Suddenly, Clara's voice echoed in Jessica's mind. The trees know. They remember. They keep us. Jessica screamed as her reflection reached out and grabbed her. The cabin dissolved into darkness, and the last thing she saw was her own face, staring back at her from within the mirror. Days later, a group of hikers found Jessica's camera lying on the forest floor. The photos told a chilling story, images of Jessica walking through the woods, the Watchers in the background, and finally, a picture of her standing in the clearing, staring into the mirror. Jessica was never found, but her image began to appear in other people's photographs taken near Hollow Brook. Locals whispered that she had joined the Watchers, her fate sealed by the forest she had dared to challenge. The legend of the Vanishing grew, and so did the warnings: never enter the woods of Hollow Brook. The trees are watching, and they never forget. Story 3: The Forgotten Laughter of Hollow Creek. In the small, forgotten town of Hollow Creek, an urban legend lingered like a specter, whispered among locals and avoided by all outsiders. The Laughing Woman, they called her, a ghostly figure said to haunt the derelict amusement park on the edge of town. The legend told of eerie laughter echoing in the dead of night, calling to anyone brave, or foolish, enough to enter. Over the years, people claimed to see her figure standing among the ruins, her skeletal smile forever etched into their memories. No one who entered alone ever came back the same. When Amelia, a journalist obsessed with urban legends, stumbled upon this tale during her research, she couldn't resist. This was the perfect story to revive her fading career. Armed with her camera and recorder, she ventured to Hollow Creek, determined to unearth the truth. The townsfolk were tight-lipped, their eyes betraying fear whenever Amelia mentioned the Laughing Woman. At the town diner, she overheard snippets of warnings. Don't go there at night. That's when she's alive. People who hear her laugh never stop hearing it. It's not just her, there's something darker there. Amelia pressed for details, but everyone avoided her questions. It wasn't until she met a frail old man, Edgar, who had worked at the amusement park decades ago. That she learned of the park's grim history. It wasn't just an accident. Edgar whispered. People say it was her husband. A jealous rage, he locked her in the Hall of Mirrors and burned the place down. Her screams were the last thing anyone heard before the fire consumed the park. But some say, she never truly left. That night, armed with only her flashlight, notebook, and camera, Amelia found herself standing before the rusted gates of the abandoned park. The air was heavy with an unexplainable dread. The carousel stood eerily intact, its chipped horses frozen mid-gallop. The roller coaster tracks loomed like skeletal fingers against the moonlit sky. As Amelia walked deeper into the park, a faint, lilting sound began to echo, soft, almost imperceptible at first. Laughter. It was high-pitched, girlish, and distant. Yet somehow it felt like it was coming from all around her. She followed the sound to the charred remains of the Hall of Mirrors. The walls were blackened, but fragments of mirrors still clung to the frames, reflecting warped versions of her own face. As she stepped inside, the laughter grew louder. Her flashlight flickered, and in its brief illumination, she saw her reflection smile, but her own lips hadn't moved. The laughter turned into whispers. They danced in the air, overlapping and blending into a maddening cacophony. Amelia tried to focus on her recorder, but it was filled with static and faint giggling. Suddenly, the mirrors began to fog over, one by one, except for the one directly ahead of her. In its glass, a woman appeared, a skeletal face with hollow eyes and a wide, bloodless grin. She wore a tattered dress, and her head tilted unnaturally to the side. "Why did you come?" the figure whispered, though her lips didn't move. Amelia froze, unable to look away. The laughing woman stepped closer, through the glass, her feet dragging against the floor. The air grew cold, and Amelia's breath clouded in front of her. "You're just like him," the ghost hissed, her smile stretching wider. Impossibly wide. Curious. Foolish. Unkind. The laughing woman's story unraveled in Amelia's mind, as though the ghost were forcing her to see it. She saw flashes of a life filled with love, betrayal, and rage. The husband's jealousy, the fire, and the laughter that turned to screams. But something didn't add up. In the final vision, Amelia saw the husband, his hands blackened from the fire, standing outside the burning Hall of Mirrors. Yet his expression wasn't one of anger, it was fear. He hadn't lit the fire. The realization hit her, the laughing woman had done it herself. In a fit of despair and madness, she had set the flames to escape the torment of her life. Her laughter had been her last act of defiance, and it had cursed the park forever. "Now," the ghost said, her voice reverberating through the room, "you'll laugh with me." Amelia tried to flee, but the park seemed alive, shifting and trapping her at every turn. The laughter became deafening, echoing inside her skull. She collapsed on the carousel, clutching her head as the painted horses came to life, their mouths stretching into grotesque grins. When she was finally found days later, wandering the outskirts of Hollow Creek, her hair had turned white, and her eyes were sunken. She could only laugh, a high, chilling laugh that never stopped. The locals said she had become a part of the legend, just another soul claimed by the laughing woman. And to this day, if you listen closely on a quiet night near Hollow Creek, you might hear two voices laughing in the ruins of the amusement park, calling you to join them.